You go. All right. So welcome to the University of California, Berkeley, located in the drought-stricken, soon-to-be People's Republic of California, where it has been raining steadily almost since November. Now that will teach you to trust the mainstream media, meteorologists, the government, or okay, I'm going to leave the humor aside and get on with the job here, which is the task of welcoming you, welcoming particularly all of the participants, including an incredibly distinguished group of folks who have come from all around the world to be able to join us for a conference entitled Circulating Health, Mediatization, and the Immobilization of Medical Subjects and Objects. Major funding comes from the University of California, Berkeley's Institute for International Studies, and this is part of a project that I co-directed with Denise Gukturk from the Department of German to explore dimensions of circulation. Other sponsors include the Department of Anthropology, the Graduate School of Journalism, the Townsend Center for the Humanities, in which we're actually holding this conference, the School of Public Health, the Berkeley Media Studies Group of the Public Health Institute, and the Folklore Graduate Program, who I think I got them all in there. The special thanks, I hope they're here, they might be outside continuing with all the labor they engaged in, are Deborah Lustig and Cynthia Alvarez, who have been working for so long and so hard to be able to make this conference possible. Maybe if we give them a round of applause, they'll hear that, and we'll tell them later what it's about. Frankly, given the caliber of the participants in this conference and the range of backgrounds they represent, I'm much more interested in listening during these 2 days than in speaking, but nevertheless, I would like to present a few words that might give you a sense as to why I'm so excited about this conference and what I hope that I will at least get out of it. Now, there are a number of ways that I could begin my remarks. I could offer a roadmap for future scholarship on media and health from the perspective of medical anthropology. I could similarly project how linguistic anthropology might inform future work. I could also try a translational turn, that is, to think about how academic research on media and medicine could be applied not just to media coverage of health, but to clinical work, health communication, epidemiology, health policy, journalism, and other areas. All of these angles might be valuable, but I don't want to travel any of them. Why? Well, recently Charles Briggs and Dan Hallin, whoever they might happen to be, published a book entitled Making Health Public. When we began working on it in 2003, graduate students, please forget that I just told you that it took us 13 years to publish this book. So when I push you to finish your dissertations, this should be erased from your memory. This is how we went about it, subjecting hundreds and hundreds of news stories to scrutiny from perspectives associated with areas of anthropology and with media studies. We drew, of course, on insightful critical work by such pioneers as Shelley Ungar, who is here with us, participating in the conversation. Many insights emerged, but we couldn't answer the basic questions that confronted us. Why is there such a proliferation of health news globally and across media platforms? So here's a quiz for you. Who came in third in the United States in 2013 after Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton? Buzz, the Zika virus. That's according to the Tyndall Report analysis of the most covered national news network topics, ahead of Bernie Sanders, Syria, the Olympics, hurricanes, tornadoes. Right? A Gallup poll from September suggests that 8% of respondents have a great deal of trust in the mass media, 8%. And 24 have a fair amount of trust, while 65 report having little or no trust. Harris tells us that only 9% of U.S. consumers trust pharmaceutical and biotech companies to put patients over profits. But guess what? Audiences still avidly consume both news media and pills. So what's going on here? Dan and I thus began to complement our qualitative and quantitative analysis of news stories with ethnography. At first in the San Diego area and then globally, we spent time speaking with the journalists who produced these newspaper, radio, television, and increasingly social media stories that we were analyzing. Nevertheless, these fascinating interviews soon showed us that we were entirely missing the boat. big conceptual opening came when I was interviewing a media consultant for pharmaceutical and biotech firms. This was in a slick corporate office. I then began the interview by asking him how he works with clients to get media coverage. And he looked at me as if I was the stupidest creature who ever walked into his office, which may be true, and said, "The media? I start with scientists to create a disease, to identify potentially valuable molecules, to attract investors, to oversee clinical trials, to be able to coordinate contact with the FDA, to hire medical writers to draft articles, set up speaking engagements at conferences," and he went on and on. He said, "And only at the very end do we worry about actually getting press coverage." Then we met people like Rich Besser, who I'm very glad to say is a participant in our conference. I can tell you that we interviewed him because he is, frankly, the only journalist who said, "Use my name, don't give me a pseudonym," in all of the hundreds of interviews that we ran. So I hope he's still happy with his decision after looking at our book, and after the conference, we'll talk about that. You can always withdraw consent, as you know. One of the leading health journalists in the world, he is a practicing pediatrician, trained as an epidemiologist, former interim director of the CDC. So after these interviews, we began to reject the idea. That's why we rejected the idea of framing my remarks as projecting the translation of scholarly research into practice, as if eggheads are clairvoyants who can tell everyone else what they need to do. Our research project only really began to emerge when we moved its location out of the academy and into the sites of practice and spoke with practitioners about how they wanted to teach us about what they did and how they think about that. We realized that we were trapped by a framework that emerged in the 17th century, and it's just common sense today. The notion that science, communication, and society are, in John Locke's words, separate provinces of knowledge, populated by distinct objects, ways of knowing, specialists. This Humpty Dumpty perspective positions health news as simply a way of communicating knowledge produced by biomedical specialists. And we were not alone in making this separation between the media and everything else. Now, we all know about Trump's attacks on the mainstream media as, sorry about this, quote, "liars, deceitful, dishonest media who got it all wrong." Now, we may not have the luxury of forgetting this point anytime soon, but you may not recall as vividly that Democratic primary candidate Bernie Sanders' lines in his stump speech basically were quite similar. What the mainstream media has, I don't do Bernie Sanders very well, but you'll have to give me, stand by me here. What the mainstream media has got to understand is they are far removed from the reality of where many American people are. Then where are the media? Bernie had an answer. The media is an arm of the ruling class of this country. Now, my goal here, to paraphrase Shakespeare, is neither to praise nor to bury the media, but to point out the power of a notion that takes some of the most complex, heterogeneous, and widely distributed and shifting phenomena and lumps them together in one stable, situated monolith. The election cycle attack on the media left this very reified notion of the media stronger and more reified, not to mention enhancing the bottom lines of some of those leading mainstream media venues. We thus came to believe that even as we learned from work in medical and linguistic and media anthropology, media and studies, media and journalism studies work, and other areas, we need to kind of mentally clean house, to do our darndest to think underneath and beyond existing ways of thinking about such powerful notions as health, media, journalism, and society, and how they and the people and objects they seem to contain are made in the course of daily life. Our quest felt more productive once we started linking the details of stories, interviews, and time spent in newsrooms, doctors' offices, clinics, public health offices, and biosecurity exercises with two frameworks, those of mediatization, particularly as elaborated in the UK and Europe. Oh, how it pains me to separate them even grammatically, but that's another story. And biomedicalization, a framework developed by my colleague Adele Clarke of UCSF and her collaborators. I'm not going to elaborate them because we're actually going to have Adele and also a leading voice in the work on mediatization, Nick Couldry, presenting shortly, and I think that also Dan Hallin in his introductory remarks might help us out in this regard. We brought these two attempts to systematically think beyond existing categories of medicine and media, to bring together scholarly traditions in an attempt not just to analyze news stories, but to enable us to think about two things that we had discovered. First, the phenomena that we initially envisioned as health news and located in media sites were produced and circulated absolutely everywhere, including doctors' offices, clinics and hospitals, research laboratories, epidemiological investigations, health policy debates, in living rooms as much as in newsrooms. At each of these sites, a variety of perspectives, forms of knowledge production, interests, inequalities, and objects got thoroughly enmeshed, such that not just health news, but fundamental notions of the body, of medicine, of society, race, class, gender, and more were co-produced in these various sites by a range of different actors. But at the same time, the old boundaries between medicine and communication were continually resurrected and reified, as was particularly apparent in the constant complaints by clinicians and public health officials that journalists were biased or sensationalist, ignorant of the science, only interested in selling newspapers or getting good ratings or attracting advertising, or by journalists who said that medical researchers and health officials were just poor communicators. We soon came to see that these caricatures bore no resemblance to the real flesh and blood people we were meeting in our interviews and ethnography. So we tried a fresh start at thinking about ways to research and to analyze through what we called biomediatization, which I think Dan will define in his remarks. Pardon us for our damage to the English language. The only way you get it in academics is you take a word and you add a prefix to it or a suffix to it, or you change it from being a noun to being a verb or something like that. If you don't coin something, nobody remembers what you're saying. Right? We started with the sort of distinctions that Nick Couldry made in his splendid 2000 book about the place of media power between media spaces and non-media spaces, between media actors and non-media actors, and analyze, in his words, the symbolic power with which the media construct reality. What was particularly valuable for studies of mediatization, we came to find, is that here this media power meets some pretty impressive loci of power themselves in little things like the American Medical Association, HMOs, pharmaceutical corporations, and governments that do and some that don't provide health care to the people living within their borders. At the same time, the very notion of the media seemed to fall apart as we watched health news forged in laboratories, clinics, public health offices, in many different spaces, and the way that news stories, advertisements, websites, social media appeared as people walked into their doctor's office and in clinical decision-making. We wondered why ANT's networks of actors and networks, traced by Bruno Latour and other scholars of science, technology, and society, right, don't seem to leave any room for journalists, let alone for newspapers or for television networks or for other non-traditional media. And thus to think about how work in medical sociology and anthropology might be transformed if people looked at how these networks are partly constituted through mediatization. We began to think that some fundamental insights into mediatization in medicine in general might emerge by placing new research in these different domains in conversation in such a way that new understandings and new collaborative research directions and even new fields might emerge. And we always knew that all we could offer is a set of preliminary ideas and methodological strategies to challenge existing boundaries and begin to think about alternatives. So from the beginning, we saw the possibility of bringing together a group of leading scholars and practitioners to really begin the hard work of charting this simultaneously altogether too familiar and still largely uncharted terrain. We also always looked ahead to collaborations aimed at exploring new forms, new partnerships across what are the boundaries, represented as the boundaries of scholarship and practice. So, at least from my perspective, that's why we're here today, and that's why I'm looking forward so much to the conversation that will unfold. And now, as in for some of our collaborations of the last 13 years, I turn it over to Dan Hallin.
Thank you, Charles. Thanks to everybody for coming. As Charles says, we're really excited that all of this diverse group of people agreed to come here and have a dialogue with one another. We really look forward to getting some new insights from this conversation. When this project was Charles's idea originally, and when Charles first came to me all those years ago and said, you know, Dan, I'm going to do a project on health coverage in the media. Would you work with me on this? I was really very reluctant about it. And I told Charles, oh, you know, Charles, that seems like kind of a dreary topic to me, honestly. My own background is in political science. I was trained a few yards over there at Barrows Hall in the political science department. I'd never done anything about health and medicine. My field is political communication. And when I think back on my initial reaction, I realized that it was rooted in the very common assumption that we critique in the book, which we call the linear transmission model of what health communication is about, which is the idea that what health journalism does is to transmit information that's produced in the realm of science to lay audiences. And according to that assumption, the role of journalism is passive, essentially, or should be. That is, if there's any independent contribution of journalism to the production of health knowledge, well, that's distortion, and that's a problem, something we should try to get rid of. So we make a critique of that point of view and argue for an alternative understanding of health journalism. As I got into the project, I actually began to realize that what we were looking at was very interesting from the point of view of social theory. In general, I began to understand that health and medicine were very interesting from the point of view of social theory, because the field of health and medicine, of biomedicine, if you will, lies very much at an intersection of social fields. It's a field of science and of professional practice, but it is also deeply entangled, as the work of Adele, Clarke, and others show, with other social fields, with the market, with the state, and also you could say with the life world in Habermas terms, that is, the realm of society in which individuals live their lives, raise their children, care for one another, make meaning, and so on. All of these different social fields have distinct actors, of course, forms of knowledge production, interests and values, and also communicative norms that clash with one another in many ways. We understand the production of health news, as Charles said, as a co-production involving actors from all of these different realms. In the end, of course, we argue that they don't remain separate from one another. They hybridize in very interesting ways. At the same time, we make the point that they don't simply merge either. There's lots of boundary work that keeps them separate and a lot of tension between them. We see the role of journalists as a role of mediating between these different actors, different forms of knowledge, different points of view about health and medicine. And we think it's actually a very active and productive role in many ways. So that's the point of view we try to develop in the book. Now, in the course of working on this book, I began to interact with a couple of really interesting bodies of literature, and our next panel will address these bodies of literature. That is the research that's been done on biomedicalization and on mediatization. These are both literatures about social change that make parallel arguments in an interesting way. So the literatures about medicalization and biomedicalization make an argument about the ways in which biomedicine increasingly comes to influence other social fields, other forms of culture, so that we think of education, for example, as a biomedical problem. If kids have trouble in school, I mean, you know the various ways in which biomedicine has penetrated into more parts of our lives. At the same time, there's a literature in media studies about mediatization, about the increasing influence of media and media logics, if you will, on other aspects of culture and society. These arguments, we came to realize that there was a very interesting problem here about how to understand these two bodies of theory at the point where the two processes intersect. That is to say, in the mediatization of health and medicine, or news coverage of health and medicine. On the surface of it, they appear contradictory, right? Because the medicalization, biomedicalization literature is making the argument that biomedicine colonizes more parts of culture and society. The mediatization literature is making a similar argument about media. But it would seem that at the place where they intersect, it has to be one or the other, right? It has to be either that biomedicine is colonizing media or the other way around. It can't be both. And so we were trying to make sense of what happens where these two processes intersect. What we argue in the book is that, in fact, they can both be true, these arguments, and in fact that they depend on one another. That is to say, to the extent that biomedicine does have these widening effects on culture and society, it happens through mediatization, and the media play a crucial role in it. And similarly, to the extent that media do in fact have an increasing influence on biomedicine, that cannot be understood apart from biomedicalization. And so we try to show how those two processes are connected to one another. So the expansion of biomedical influence happens through mediatization, not just news, of course, but also direct-to-consumer advertising and other things. And similarly, the growing centrality of media in biomedicine takes place to a large extent precisely because of the wide range of interests that are affected, the wide range of entanglements between biomedicine and other social fields, and the ways in which, as Adele, Clarke, and others who've written on biomedicalization point out, the ways in which the internal structure of biomedicine becomes increasingly complicated as these entanglements take place, thereby creating the space for journalists to come in and, for example, force different factions within the biomedical community to answer publicly, to air their debates publicly. So these are some of the kinds of issues that we address in the book, and we're hoping to learn more from all of you about them. Now, with that, let me turn to introducing our first speakers. They are Nick Couldry, he's chair of communication and social theory at the London School of Economics, who's played a central role in developing theories of mediatization, and Adele Clarke from Sociology and History of Health Sciences at UC San Francisco, who has played a central role in developing the concept of biomedicalization. Let me just add two other points here. These are both points that Nick and Adele, I think, have begun to address, but I hope we'll go further with them in this. One of them is that I think that in both of these literatures, we clearly have to move away from zero-sum conceptions of these processes. mediatization and biomedicalization. That is to say, we're not dealing with a set of relationships here in which media expand their influence at the expense of other social fields, nor the other way around. It's something much more complex than that. It involves various forms of hybridization. And similarly, I think we have to put both of these processes within the wider social context. So that's partly why we bring together here people from so many different fields. So for example, in the case of mediatization, I think more and more people in media studies are beginning to understand that, to put it this way, a purely media-centric understanding of mediatization is not the way to go. So in order to understand biomediatization, for example, you have to put the role of media in the context of this wider set of changes in the social role, the social structure of biomedicine itself, and its connections not only with the media, but also with the state, with the market, with other aspects of culture. So this is partly what we're trying to accomplish in this session today. So I guess Nick is first, is that right?
Yes. No, we have to get... Hi, I'm Nick Couldry, and thanks very much to Dan and Charles for the introduction. I'm delighted to be here. I'm honoured in particular that they're allowing me to open this for two reasons. One is that, as they very well know, I have no expertise in the area of health or medicine. And although I'm very interested in what I'm going to learn in the next 2 days. And secondly, although I'm a great enthusiast for their book, the actual final version of it, by some quirk of publishing practice or maybe the mail service, never actually got to me, so I haven't read it. Maybe you have. So what I'm going to say is based in blissful ignorance of the final version of their book, but based around my extreme excitement about where it was going when I saw a version last. Instead, I'm going to give you an account of what I'm working on right now, which I've been very excited to find does intersect in very interesting ways with Adele Clarke's work. And I think you'll see some of the wider convergences that they were alerting to, but not exactly in the form you might expect if you expected me to react to their book. And my starting point is going to be that media have played a fundamental role in the emergence of modernity's institutions, the forms of coordination in particular, on which they rely. And in my paper, I'm going to mean by media not just mass media in the conventional sense, nor even just the internet or the World Wide Web. I mean by media the wider set of technologies which institutionalize communication. And that broad definition is very important for a number of reasons. One in particular is a sense is now emerging, I think, for many of us in many domains that the key institutions of modernity, corporations and churches, civil society organizations and governments, media organizations themselves, other knowledge institutions such as the medical field, are all of them now being disrupted by a new pattern of institutionalization driven by a highly distinctive stage in the development of media in this very broad sense, by which I mean datafication. And I want to consider datafication and its implications for social order and the possible interplay of all of this with some larger independent developments in the medical field. And my paper is going to draw extensively on the argument of my recent book with Andreas Hepp, The Mediated Construction of Reality. Andreas is also here, so if you don't like my version of it, you can ask him. And our book definitely, as Dan said, tries to move beyond any idea of a zero-sum game, let alone a media-centric view of these transformations, which simply misses the point. And the argument I'm going to make involves also an underlying move, which is to try and uncover the role that communications have in fact always played in enabling coordination, in enabling the coordinated spaces of exchange and interaction that are intrinsic to modernity. And yet institutional analysis very often is tempted to see through communication, to focus on the supposedly harder structures that underlie change. But recent changes in the organization of communication, particularly datafication, are so profound that they make completely invalid any attempt to see through communication's role in social order, in the forming of institutions. The changes we're encountering today actually affect the basic ways in which people and resources can be organized to form anything like a social order. And so what I'm going to be arguing is that mediatization, datafication, as an example of mediatization, and to some degree, biomedicalization, are all aspects, if seen from different perspectives, of this wider set of transformations. This intensification of communications in the last 2 decades has involved a key, very simple condition, which is the embedding of most actions in something like a new communications system, which enables the generation of economic value in new ways. For example, through data, through the gathering, the processing, the evaluating, the selling of data constituted by acts of communication themselves. And the economic basis, however, on which most aspects of this system happens to have been developed, which is free access, has an alarming consequence. That, as computer security expert Bruce Schneier put it bluntly, the primary business model of the internet is built on mass surveillance. And this outcome, which is highly political in its implications, is an example of a much broader process, which is the role that media and communications technologies and the institutions they comprise and support have had in the development of modernity, in some sense. And in the past, this role of media in modernity has tended to be seen principally from the perspective of the media that mass-produce content, which of course remains very important. But less often celebrated, but equally important, I think, media's role in a different sense, which is as infrastructures for distributing content of all sorts from anywhere to anywhere, that are essential in underpinning the possibility of markets, states, and so on. For example, the modern postal service is just maybe declining these days, but it certainly historically is just one example of the type of change that was essential to the development of the modern state, the modern economy, the world system. So I'm talking here about media as communication technologies and their role in patterns of organizing everything. Craig Calhoun noted in an important essay from 25 years ago, very little read for some reason, that state power could grow because the new forms of organization and the improved transportation and communications infrastructure enabled the spread of increasingly effective administration throughout the various territories of a country. But that's not enough to recognize. A full account, he said, needs to recognize that the growth of the state, like the capitalist economy, developed infrastructures that could be used by ordinary people to develop connections with each other. James Benninger's brilliant book, The Control Revolution, uncovers a 19th century example of this, and this is the least media-centric account of media you can find in the literature, and that's why it was so important when it came out way ahead of the debates, in fact. What he called a complex of rapid changes in the technological and economic arrangements that led to a crisis of control, in which information processing and communications practices lagged behind, in that case, energy production, manufacturing, and transportation. Grasping the implications of these sorts of change for social order requires us to step back to some degree from the details of particular media and their contents and production processes, and consider the whole mass of ways in which media, in this very broad sense, interrelate with each other, and that our interactions with media interrelate with other types of interaction. And this is the set of, if you like, society-wide transformations that the term mediatization is designed to signal. Now, this term mediatization points, therefore, to broad social transformations, not centered, as it were, in media, but passing through them, essentially, which result from the various embeddings of media technologies in every aspect of life at different historical moments. The print era, electrification were the two first stages of mediatization, we argue in our book. But today we're facing something very different from those stages. Sonia Livingston in our field has referred to the mediation of everything. And this, occurring over the past 2 decades in many countries, has generated, over time, across space, a different type of social order in which every element of which media is involved. If there is no particular reality or element of reality anymore which is unmediated, then social reality at a higher level of complexity, that is what we call social order, must itself be transformed in its nature. Deep mediatization, our concept in our book, points to this change in the very nature of social order that results from the distinctive phases of mediatization that we call digitalization, that's pretty familiar, and datafication, which is less familiar. In deep mediatization, increased linkages between media deepen the connectedness of the infrastructures on which media-related practice depends. And they also deepen the layering of the connected media practices in which individuals, groups, institutions are routinely engaged. Digitalization, the era we take for granted when digital media are embedded in every aspect of life, is one phase of deep mediatization. But we should no longer think of it as the climax of this development, because now we see signs, we have for the first 5 years, of a further wave of mediatization, which we want in the book to call datafication. This is a phase related to data, bringing in changes much more far-reaching than those associated with digitalization. So, what is distinctive about datafication as part of this longer-term history of mediatization? Sorry for all these pile-up of long words, but it's partly a matter of changes in computer process data's role in social life, at the input end, if you like, and it's partly a matter of the consequences of all of that interacting with the other levels and with the rest of society. The consequences for the possibilities of social organization. This is the starting point, so banal we barely notice it, that access to the internet on a continuous basis has become normalized for social actors, broadly speaking, wherever and whenever they are. I leave aside issues around digital divide, which are clearly really important. But for the societies we can assume this is a model for some social actors. The diffusing of the possibility of network transmission and network reception across much of the population has changed the basic resources of everyday social action. Let me give you a metaphor. Instead of what once used to be the case, that the option to act at a distance was something we had to load at a particular moment in time by picking up a particular technology, switching on the computer, sending an email, switching on the radio, picking up a newspaper. Now I think we can say that social space is for many of us at all times sprung with the potential of acting and being acted on at a distance, from multiple directions, in multiple modalities of communication, often simultaneously. The nature of social space has changed. In the sense I'm not really interested in mediatization as a word, I'm interested in this type of interlinked transformation, which we need a word to point to, because it is a very significant transformation. Now, of course, such a transformation might sound like a great advance for human freedom. But because this new sprung potential of social action is always two-way, it involves not just actions between individuals, but actions, for example, by corporations on individuals. And because corporations are very different from human individuals, they can act through the night, across time and space, they can act more consistently on the social than individuals, human individuals can. As a result, social space-time becomes open to something it never has before, which is saturation. Not just by individuals and groups, in the sense it's never been other than saturated by us, by humans, but saturation by corporate action. And that is radically new. In harness with the continuous embedding of internet scale into everyday action has come the development of new channels for organizing the forms that this saturation takes. And I mean here the rise of what we often call platforms. Platforms are not just particular platforms. They are a new form, a new social form which is very significant. I see platforms as an institutionalized way of, if you like, optimizing the overlap between social interaction and profit, or at least hoped for profit. The word platform actually belies a much more dramatic shift from a world until, let's say, the mid-2000s of largely non-networked social action, concentrated nowhere in particular, to a world from the mid-2000s of pervasively networked social action mediated by a small number of interconnected platforms under corporate, not public ownership, that is something like a communication system. That's why I used the word communication system earlier, not because I'm a Luhmannian, for example, believing in the natural existence of systems, on the contrary. But we're approaching something system-like under very particular conditions. Because of choices about open accessibility, connectability, associated with the notions of freedom associated with the early internet, the system that we have today is driven economically. Its profits are principally made through the collection of data, as we all know. Data about the processes that constitute the connections between us. Data doesn't just naturally exist, so its collection has to itself be driven by transforming the flow of social life, individual life, into data inputs, datafication. Through the continuous collection, and for some of us, some institutions, the continuous availability of data about countless aspects of human life, the world has become actionable in a completely different way from in the past. And because knowledge feeds into and results from action, the very basis, therefore, on which human actors, institutional actors, act in the world has itself changed. And yet, the implications of all of this, of datafication for social order, perhaps for the legitimacy of social institutions, are largely unexplored. And so, for now, they're radically uncertain. But I want to explore them a bit in the next few minutes. The uncertainty about what datafication means for social order stems from two fundamental factors. One I've just touched on, which is the sheer depth, the complex interrelatedness of how data processes are embedded in all sorts of interactions and transactions, in their very constitution, embedded in the evaluations on which they depend, of the interrelations that they're capable. So we have the problem of depth. The other reason why it's difficult to see what datafication means derives from the basic workings of data process, which I want to spend more time on. The first fundamental point is that data categorize us. Data processing is, as Oscar Gandy, who was the pioneer of research into corporate practices of data collection in the 1980s and early 90s, put it, data processing is always a discriminatory technology that works for the integrated functions of identification, classification, and then assessment or evaluation. But data processing is inherently asymmetrical in its power effects. And that asymmetry is not a result of a conspiracy. It derives from the very characteristics of databases formed out of data. As Jeff Bowker puts it, the database has a distinctive type of power, which he calls jussive, from the Latin word to order, an ordering power based on the exclusionary principle that determines what can and cannot be stored in a particular form and format in the database. And that power is never negotiable from the perspective of who or what is classified. It's already been exercised before the classification has taken place. That's not to say, of course, pessimistically, that we can't interact with the results of classifications that come from datafication. We certainly do interact with all forms of social classification, as Ian Hacking famously pointed out. What, however, is harder to interact with in the sense of negotiate, resist, open out to alternative interpretation, what's harder to interact with are the constructions of social interaction that are driven by data processing, the need for profit through data. And that's what interests me most. What I think is striking about the configurations of social media platforms is that we act on and through them largely as if they were not configurations, as if they were not constructions. The very idea of a platform I see as a sort of constructed space where what should be a sharp border between everyday interactions and commercial transactions appears completely porous. There's barely even an interface between the social and the commercial, a seamless data flow. And as we get into the habit of living and interacting on the basis of such platforms, given that we naturally desire to be social, we become entangled in something less natural, what Plantin and Sandvig and others call a growing social commitment to functionality, to doing what we have to do to be on the platform. In other words, a type of social order that we have not committed to before. So what you might be asking impatiently, what is the link with medicine and biomedicalization here? Let me draw out some specific aspects of datification that I think it will make it to see easier, these links. And let me acknowledge right away that I don't think that datification is as well developed a concept as biomedicalization. It certainly isn't. Maybe it doesn't have to be, because all it is a word pointing to a particular level of organization that affects all sorts of interaction at any level, any domain of society. It's not trying to develop a theory, a model of the complex multidimensional transformation of a particular domain as biomedicalization is. It's a much more modest concept. But you'll see there are some interesting resonances. Let me just start off by mentioning that biomedicalization is those 5 factors, which most of you will know about far more than me. But it's very important, and I'm deeply impressed by how multidimensional a model it is. It covers the change in the political economy of biomedicine, a change in the object of knowledge in medicine, from the cure of illness to the reproduction of health, which itself defines the risks and the ways of managing risks which are inherent to medicine. Thirdly, it involves the increased use of technology in biomedicine. Also, transformations in the circulation of biomedical knowledge and the management of that information. And finally, and just as important, transformations in the bodies that biomedicine governs. And the upshot of these linked transformations is the massive expansion of authority, the jurisdiction of medicine in the social world. It's a wonderfully rich model. Datification, by contrast, is unashamedly a one-dimensional process, though a highly pervasive one, but it has very complicated side effects. Datification, as we define it in our book, is the wave of mediatization when an increasing proportion of communication relies on infrastructures based in collecting and processing data. It could affect any domain, not just health. But there is also an overlap, which is clear from the beginning. As Adele Clarke and her colleagues note, the incorporation of computer and information technologies was crucial to the emergence of biomedicine and it changed it from the inside out. I really like that phrase. And there's no doubt that processes of datification are part of that same dynamic that they point to, although it could not have been as clear back in 2003 when they wrote their famous paper. But of course, biomedicalization goes much further than that, and I won't claim to touch on the other aspects of the model. And instead, I want to go through datification a bit more slowly. Datification actually has some very interesting features which map more closely onto some of the points that Adele Clarke and others brought out. First of all, a deepening of stratification, because of the simple nature of datification that it hierarchizes. Secondly, datification is always dependent on the continuous automated collection of data, normally less politely known as surveillance, which installs surveillance as a routine mode of managing risk, defining risk even. Thirdly, under these conditions, the position of individual actors is transformed. Individuals feel pressure to act responsibly by submitting to surveillance, self-surveillance. Self-surveillance comes to seem a requirement of responsible action. Of course, we've always had a duty to be reflexive about ourselves, but that bears little relation to today's sense of self-surveillance, which is submission to contingent demands of highly specific institutional structures that manage risk through systems those institutions largely control. Self-tracking devices being a key area. And these three factors lead to a fourth area, which is the growing reach of the institutional powers that underlie datafication. As yet, we are much less clear of the meaning of that than we are clear of the transformation of authority in the biomedical field. We'll have to find out more about that. Let me give you a few examples which come from a recent project that I'm doing at LSE called The Price of Connection, of how this plays out in the medical field, on which we have a case study. Here, for example, is IBM's large-scale health data enterprise, IBM Watson Health, who've got a collaboration with a sports clothing company in developing a cognitive coaching system. They say on their website a person can compete and compare against other people that are the same age. You might see that there are 4.5 million other people in the database today that are just like you. They make it sound as if it's almost cognitively healthy to take part in this because, as they say, if you take part, we can eliminate silos that hinder collaboration between researchers, patients, clinicians, and create opportunities for those communities to share and learn from one another. Or listen to the IBM-Apple collaboration Health Kit and Research Kit, who refer to the 9 billion connected devices generating 2.5 quintillion bytes of new data daily, yet without a proper infrastructure in place to analyze all of this, the value is minimal. So we have to support that infrastructure. The activities of that infrastructure are, however, moving ever deeper into our lives, our bodies. The Google-related company Calico, which has a project called Verily, had on its website recently the following statements. These statements have been taken down for reasons I don't understand. About the mission of the project. They say that smaller devices fit more easily into daily life so they can monitor conditions more consistently and proactively signal when something is amiss. It sounds comforting, but how comforting depends very much on how this information management system operates. Who operates it? How is it controlled? Or we could look at device developers such as Ginger.io, who propose a computer-based health coach as part of a comprehensive care plan that depends on the active involvement of the health subject in data collection. As they advise on their website, get proactive help. Haven't spoken to anyone in a couple of days? Well, your phone automatically sends basic information to your coach so they can check in on you. But as this already implies, it's not a detail emphasized on the website, but it's very important. The data collection here goes beyond health information to include metadata about the general use of one's devices, so-called user interaction data, metadata relating not only to one's health or even health device use, but to the use of one's phone, indeed all one's devices, because they should all be connected. The collection of health data, absolutely valid in its own terms, becomes seamlessly integrated into a larger environment of comprehensive data collection. There have been lots of debates also about the genetic case. I won't go into those, except just to quote from 23andMe, the famous West Coast company, who encouraged people to learn about their DNA and share the information about that. As they say, when you send in that DNA sample, you're not only learning about yourself, you're joining a community of motivated individuals which can collectively impact research and basic human understanding. In today's connected information age, it's no longer just about me. The role of datafication, therefore, in expanding today the scope of biomedicalization is very clear, and the pro-social rhetoric is quite intoxicating. But I want to ask, what are its implications for the sorts of societies we live in, for the sorts of social order which are now possible? And this is where I'll be ending up. Seen from one perspective, the implications are quite clear. They are about the costs of a social fabric built from continuous mutual surveillance. The price of datafication is beautifully captured in Dave Eggers' novel and now film, The Circle, in the paradoxical image of a system which he calls sea change, which describes itself as ultimate transparency. No filter, see everything, always. This philosophy of dataism, including its messianic forms, such as the writings of Kevin Kelly, the idea that one must just relax one's inhibitions and share, provides no foundation for grasping the social order at all. For that, we need a historical perspective and a phenomenological sensitivity. We need to go back to writers such as Benninger and his thought about, from the 19th century, the progressive layering of control levels. And we must also do with a normative sensitivity. Here I go back, and Andreas and I do, to Norbert Elias, the great social theorist of interdependence, who wrote half a century ago, that when we think about interdependence and how it's changing, what we have to think about is what happens to people in the course of this change. If we don't, then any scientific effort might as well be spared. Which makes me think of some of the return to normativity in recent sociology. Axel Hannah's attempt to think not just about reification, but the tendency today to self-reification. Is datafication part of an emergent process of incentivized self-reification? To wrap up, one implication would move from here to study the impacts on institutions, on legitimacy, on the credibility of institutions. That's extremely important. Instead, I just want to end by mentioning two trends associated with individuals which come out of these things, which particularly impact on individuals. First is the entrenchment of socioeconomic and ethnic inequality. If data always works to discriminate, why would we expect datafication not to entrench earlier forms of inequality? How would we stop that? I don't know how we would stop it. And secondly, even more importantly, the increasing use of force, something like force, rather than norms, to constitute social order. I've given you some examples to show how we're encouraged to participate in certain ways, and that sounds something we can laugh off, relatively straightforward. But Julie Cohen, the legal theorist, points to a different type of force, which is our absolute requirement to submit to the technical requirements of the information systems on which we rely to be present to each other. She calls these systems authoritarian because they're based on compliant submission to authority, not on consent. You might, however, my final point, say, hang on, stop the critique. This is really about complexity. We need this sort of infrastructure to get along with each other and function at all in increasingly complex societies, and I don't doubt that. But it's important to remember that if we think about the role of convention, one of the leading philosopher of convention, David Lewis, wrote that conventions are regularities in behavior sustained by our interest in coordination and expectation that others will do their part. But the systems of coordination we're looking at today are not about our interest in coordination, they're about commercial platforms' interest in engineering the coordinated generation of data to ensure the maximization of profit. And that is a very different type of social order from any one that we have contemplated in the history of humanity before. So I hope I've shown there's something to be gained from mediatization going to biomedicalization and the other way around. Certainly, I've learned a lot from reading Adele's paper, and I'm going to learn a lot for the next 2 days. So thank you very much.
First, thanks to Charles and Dan for inviting me to this fascinating conference on a topic in which I have little expertise but much interest. It's been an unexpected pleasure to rethink this nexus of issues. Following tradition, I have a new title. This session on mediatization vis-à-vis biomedicalization centers on the relations in biomediatization and beyond, which need to be examined and unpacked. But not only through the work of Charles and Dan, I did get to read the book. I see biomediatization as sets of assemblages that are differently co-constituted historically and geopolitically across time, space, and circumstance. Why add the bio to medicalization? I did this on did so on my own in the 1990s for a number of reasons, including, and one issue important to me, was that medicalization theory and sociology about the expanding jurisdiction of medicine into new domains continued to ignore the growing importance of sciences and technologies, including information and computer sciences, to medicine. So for me, the bio connoted a more biological, what it is up there, more biological, bioscientific, biotechnological, biomedicine, considering biopower, biopolitics, invoking biocapital and bioentrepreneurship, with new concepts such as Rabinow's biosociality and biomedicalization, and reminding us that bios is life itself, right, with vital politics. So we did the ASA article the concept then exploded through a major collaboration I had with 4 doctoral students in sociology at UCSF. We fleshed out the concept together. They each had a wonderful empirical dissertation project that was a case study of biomedicalization in itself. And we argued that there are 5 key processes. And these, Nick just went over these a bit, so here they are again in case you didn't get them on the first round. And we because we had such interesting case materials, such interesting empirical materials, I think the conceptualization ended up much more richly than it would through any one project. And I was, one of my data sources for biomedicalization was serving as chair of my department at UCSF, which is a health sciences campus during this little period, which basically means that you go to meetings and they try to tell you what's coming next down the health stream, right? Down the healthcare stream. So it was very politically, economically, et cetera, interesting. Shortly after that, our chancellor came from Genentech, so that's where we were at the time. So in our 2003 paper, we focused only on the medicalization and biomedicalization eras. For our 2010 book, as an historical sociologist of medicine and the health sciences, I found that much too limiting, and we did this three eras. My own work in that volume extended back to the rise of medicine, both in analytic charts and in one of my favorite projects, a visual cultural exploration of the healthscapes in each of these eras, which I'll discuss later in my talk. The question marks there indicate that I don't know media history enough, and I'm not sure of their datings in terms of what I have up there. So today my focus is largely historical, and I'm going to talk about the origins of the concept of biomedicalization in my own scholarship, and then a piece of my historical healthscapes project on the rise of medicine era as a means of analyzing how medicine and visual culture and media are co-constitutive. This era set the stage for medicalization and biomedicalization, and hence for biomediatization. And most of you were the experts on biomediatization, so with great relief, I now leave that topic to the other presenters. So while this presentation is a series of reflections on medicine and media rather than an integrated whole, undergirding it is an assertion that I came to through reading Charles and Dan's excellent book. Initially, my main conclusion was that the topic of relations between medicine and media needs to be revisited from past to present, at least since the founding of the AMA in the 1840s, and that gaining a better grip on the rise of medicine era, 1890 to World War II, may be key to a better understanding of both. I later found Nick Couldry's forthcoming paper on medicine, on media and modernity, which he was talking about today, and he contributes to that project precisely. But I now think, having read more, that needed approaches are considerably broader. As scholars of things medical, we have largely looked over the shoulder of one major actor at a time. Biomedicalization over the shoulder of medicine, biomediatization over the shoulder of media, pharmaceuticalization over the shoulder of pharma, etc. Thing-focused projects, I come from science studies, have looked a bit more broadly. For example, Nellie Ouchorn's work on the male birth control pill looked over that shoulder at science, at clinical testing, and to the terrible and terribly sexist media coverage of it that contributed considerably to the fact that after 50 years, this product has not been released in a world that needs every safe form of birth control created. I'm asserting that innovative projects in future need to look over the shoulders of all the actors and actants in the specific situation being studied simultaneously. When did different actors, human and non-human, enter that situation? Why and how? Why did they do that? What else is there? Briggs and Hallin wrote about attending to the kinds of boundary work going on in the complex relations between multiple shifting logics of science, medicine, capitalism, and journalism. Boundary work is negotiation of various kinds in a specific terrain. What they and Nick Couldry and I are all pointing to, I think, is the biomedical sector of capital. Eisenhower framed the U.S. defense sector as the military-industrial complex in his farewell speech of '61. HealthPAC then framed the medical-industrial complex in '71. In 2003, we merged this with Haraway's The New World Order, Inc., to frame the biomedical techno-service complex, Inc., which is even more of a mouthful than biomedicalization, but it's vast. So my overall assertion is that future research needs to focus on what happens in the biomedical sector overall around a particular issue. These are long-term sectoral relations that morph into specific, though shifting assemblages around any particular product. In STS terms, one would be analytically plopping down whatever product or phenomenon of interest in the middle and then looking at everything else constellated around it. Certainly attending to science, medicine, capitalism, and journalism, as Briggs and Hallin advised, but also looking to see what else may be there, shaping the conditions of possibility in that situation. Okay. The concept of biomedicalization emerged initially from several threads of my earlier work. First was medicalization, at least three. So in terms of medicalization of women's health, the concept of medicalization was developed by the late Irv Zola, circa 1972, was a radical, critical, and progressive intervention in medical sociology, soon taken up by HealthPAC and other early health social movements organizations as critique. Not incidentally, Irv was married to Judy Norsigian, one of the co-founders of Our Bodies, Ourselves. Feminist medical sociology was infused with medicalization theory and, unlike many, if not most, other health social movements, such as that around HIV/AIDS, many feminist health movements were explicitly resistant to medicalization of women's health and lives. Women's health has been one of my primary scholarly commitments since the 70s. Returning from my PhD in sociology in 1980 at UCSF, I was soon swept up into then emergent science and technology studies and generated a dissertation project on the history of American reproductive sciences in biology and medicine. I thought I'd be focusing largely after World War II, but soon realized that the story began in the 1890s and very much involved agricultural science as well, taking me far beyond what I knew. I dug deeply into the archives of the University of Chicago, Johns Hopkins, and UC Davis, which was an agriculture extension of Berkeley in those days, my biological, medical, and agricultural case study sites. And I observed a major early 20th century change in the focus of life sciences happen in those archival materials. The life sciences shifted from a largely morphological research, needing only a few good dead specimens preserved for long-term use, such as in the zoological campus, the museum on campus here, to experimental physiological research with ongoing demands for lots of the same kinds of living organisms and increasingly specialized forms, including the first primate colonies, of which Yerkes was one and which I studied. In short, the whole situation of life sciences research changed dramatically, and the scientists were themselves hustling intensely to get their labs organized to be able to do the new experimental physiological research. During this period, what we now call biology or the life sciences, the terms were not used until the early 20th century, were built from zoology, physiology, anatomy, and later chemistry and into biochemistry. Not only did this happen in the sciences, but also in medicine and agriculture. In some fields, scientists were able to make career moves not only between campuses, but across both disciplinary and professional boundaries. For example, agricultural scientists from Australia and Wisconsin ended up on the faculty of Harvard Med School. As we argued about medicalization post-1980, computer and information sciences and molecular biology reorganized medicine from the biomedicine from the inside out, then this earlier parallel shift from morphological to experimental physiological research was just as if not more revolutionary. But you may now be asking, where were medicine and media in all of this? Both shifts involved sectoral reinstitutionalization, major changes in institutional infrastructures of that economic sector, which also ultimately involved medicine and the media of the day, organizationally and institutionally. In the late 1980s, I had an NIMH postdoc at Stanford, ostensibly on organizations. Because of the major changes in institutional infrastructures I had seen in the history of the life sciences, I spent the better part of those 2 years with the historians of economics and business and in their highly specialized libraries. I was trying to figure out what I now call this sectoral reinstitutionalization that essentially assembled together, varyingly and sometimes for the first time, university-based life sciences, medical schools, the agricultural sciences, and then emergent life sciences focused corporations and emergent corporate alliances focused on pharmaceuticals, medical devices, biological and laboratory supplies, industries, hospital supplies, and so on. This figure, a quite amazing historical figure, was part of a 1934 grant application submitted to the Rockefeller-funded committee that supported reproductive sciences by a group from the University of Wisconsin. Here we see the areas where the products of basic reproductive sciences could be applied, clearly specified, illustrating not only the practical goals of Rockefeller investment in those sciences, but also the coalescing industrial institutional linkages of reproductive sciences. As this grant app reveals, the scientists themselves understood the implications of the institutional changes for their own work as well, promoting it towards gaining funding. My unresearched speculation here is that the media were among the early industry linkages in the incipient vision of the medical industrial complex initiated in the US in the late 19th century. One new contributing factor to this emerging infrastructure of legitimation and expansion was co-location of universally based life sciences, allopathic or regular medical schools, which are often part of brand new state universities, and later new schools of journalism and departments of communication. What happened? In certain cities, these universities would be linked with distinctive local industries, such as in Chicago, the meatpacking industry was a major supplier of research materials for University of Chicago scientists. New pharmaceutical corporations hired the newly minted Masters of Science students from the university, and senior professors consulted with these corporations in organizing their curricula, and I saw this in the archives. While the media would be reporting on all of the above, hence part of the assemblage, they came late to campus. Missouri was one of the earliest schools of journalism. Thank you for correcting my mistake about Columbia. And added a graduate school in '35, the first in the US. I know that there are histories of each of the elements in such assemblages, but I don't know if the assemblages per se, including the media, have been studied. So examining their co-institutionalization and co-location might be especially interesting and worthwhile projects. One last thing that inspired me was doing this paper, but I'm not going to go into it because I don't have time. I just couldn't resist the overhead. In our biomedicalization project, each of my 4 collaborators had a remarkable empirical project. So we next published our book. And my own contribution was the paper on visual cultures. And I argued there that the development of things medical in the past and today are not only accompanied by and reflected in popular cultural iconography, and but also were and continue to be in part generated and produced through them. Visual things medical, my generic term, included paintings, photographs, advertisements, packing materials, books, pamphlets, comic books, magazine images, plays, movies, television shows, and so on. Coming from an STS perspective, visual materials are non-human actants writ large and do many kinds of work. My argument was that in deeply significant but largely ignored ways, American medicine itself is imbricated with popular and visual cultural materials, representations, and media coverage of things medical. Significantly, the quantity, pace, and extent of exposure of major segments of the American populace to such representations expanded dramatically in the late 19th century with the rise of regular medicine gaining momentum and with new media. In selecting representative visuals for each era, I sought those that were the most likely to be seen by the most people. And in turn, such images and objects themselves have become constitutive of medical knowledges and practices. So I used the concept of healthscapes based on Apodrai, inspired by Apodrai, and presented 3 eras of the rise of medicine, medicalization, and biomedicalization as healthscapes. A way of grasping through words, images, material, cultural objects, pattern changes that have occurred in the many and varied sites where health and medicine are performed, who is involved, sciences and technologies used, media coverage, etc., etc. Healthscapes are themselves assemblages that attempt to capture what Foucault called regimes of practices. Healthscapes also address, historically, a gap in the analysis of how medicine gained both economic and cultural authority and legitimacy. Healthscapes approximate and integrate all kinds of imagery and media into their legitimation work, from globe-hopping TV doctor shows to pharmaceutical packing materials. Legitimation work is hagiographic and thereby simultaneously advertises that which it legitimates, the visual cultures of things medical, to the fundamental cultural work of linking medicine to modernity. And I was pleased to see another scapes presentation on the schedule. Leo Chavez on disease-scapes, framing immigrants as a medical threat. Is he here? Did you get him? Good. I hope to talk to you later. Today I'm going to end with a synopsis of the rise of medicine healthscape, as our original work only addressed post-World War II. While the AMA was founded in 1847, its Western scientific allopathic form of medicine did not achieve dominance over the competition in the U.S., chiropractic, homeopathic, etc., until the late 19th century, and it succeeded through these various strategies. The last is particularly important by using the media to attack other forms of healing as quackery and other kinds of practitioners as inherently incompetent quacks. And there were routinely stories of quackery as the state licensure struggles were going on, which had to happen in every single state. You had to get the legislature to do legitimate this particular kind of medicine. AMA infrastructure building was deeply community and state-based. Profound sponsorship of regular medicine by major foundations such as Rockefeller and Carnegie in the early 20th century sealed its success, enabling its science and furthering professionalization and closing most competing medical schools. By World War I, allopathic or regular medicine had become just plain medicine in much of the U.S., a generally unmarked category, though it is not in the rest of the world. During this golden age of medicine, the life sciences became joined with them at the hip, and World War I furthered this relationship immensely, and with government and foundations, and likely media, but I don't know much of that. Historian of medicine Nancy Tomes tells us that various merchants of health actively integrated medicine and consumer culture. By 1930, healthcare medicine was already a major industry in the U.S. Even during the Great Depression, we spent $3.5 billion annually on medical services and commodities, and the healthcare sector ranked 6th among in the economy, which I was so shocked by. Hugely important, health in a bottle and a book were much more widely accessible because new forms of media and marketing multiplied the commercial opportunities for self-medication. Tuesday, I discovered that Tomes has a new book, Remaking the American Patient, How Madison Avenue and Modern Medicine Turned Patients into Consumers, from University of North Carolina Press, and a website on Medicine and Madison Avenue at Duke that covers 1913 to 1960. Significantly, medical iconography was specifically constitutive of the standardization of American medicine in concept, if not in practice. This was enabled by a key change in popular culture captured by Edward Slauson, head of the Science Service in Washington, 1923. He stated, "The seeing of the same pictures and reading the same magazines at the same time to the greater part of the 100 million people of the United States tends toward conformity of taste and ideas toward the standardization of the American." Raymond Williams argued that the half century from 1880 to 30 saw the full development of an organized system of commercial information and persuasion as part of a modern distributive system in conditions of large-scale capitalism led by drug and toiletries advertising. So, here's the fun part. By the 1920s, the AMA was actively shaping media representations of medicine in positive and uncritical directions, often accomplished by dissolving boundaries between entertainment and education. The main clinical mode of action of allopathic medicine during this era and significant for its success was the development of safe and effective surgery. Painter Thomas Eakins' classic The Agnew Clinic is iconic, often linked to the rise of medicine. It brilliantly captures the great man era and positions medicine closer to religion than to capitalism. Regular physicians differentiated themselves from quacks by displaying their safeness through gentlemanly attributes and appeals to science, education, institutional affiliation, scientific knowledge, humanity, and public spirit. Performances of proper race, class, and gender, indeed. Among the most famous and reproduced medical paintings of all time is The Doctor by Luke Fildes, painted after the death of his son. It was the subject of a 1911 Edison film, part of a major exhibit at Chicago Century of Progress Exposition in 1933 that traveled to 18 American cities and was viewed by 5 million people. In 1947, this became the image on the U.S. postage stamp commemorating the 100th anniversary of the founding of the AMA. He reflects the moral mission of medicine of the era rather than the technical innovation captured in the Agnew Clinic. Oop, not yet. The Doctor inspired a subsequent series of 85 paintings known as Great Moments in the History of Medicine, sponsored by Park Davis and Company and distributed to hang in physicians' offices and other medical venues, permeating popular visual culture of medicine pre-TV. This is a etching about an early form of the X-ray, a major technology of that era. It's called the fluoroscope, and it combined X-rays with a fluorescent screen. The interior is seen immediately by the doctor without having to be developed, so the person just stood behind it, as shown. As the physician observes, the patient looks on, now part of the background in his own exam. Later in this era, advertising industries were influenced by Edward Bernays, Freud's nephew, who translated elements of Freudian theory into what I called capitalist public relations theory. Advertising then shifted from an educational orientation focused on product merits to creating desire through emotions. One subgenre of this was called goodwill advertising, and this image by another pharma company, Squibb and Sons, is an exemplar promoting positive views of medical science and the medical profession, sustaining incipient biocapital and eugenics. The rise of medicine was also about place. This photograph of the Los Angeles County University of Southern California Medical Center in 1933 was characteristic of the rise of medicine healthscape, capturing its grandiosity and the emergence of the hospital as a citadel of healthcare, a medical skyscraper. Hospitals became the new cathedrals of urban America. However, some Americans could not afford such white palaces. I can't talk about the other two healthscapes very much, but there are two images I want to show. One, as a physician's house call disappeared in the 1950s and 60s, the major new medium of television entered the home of most Americans, delivering images of physicians instead. Marcus Welby, which ran from 69 to 76, was one. He received approximately 5,000 letters per week from people seeking medical assistance, and the show received 30 awards, including one from the AMA, to which scripts were submitted for approval in advance. Briggs and Hallin note that in the 60s, the AMA and the individual physicians ruled the medical airways as authorized knowers. Indeed. Several new media emerged during this era. One was the comic book, which generated superheroes that include super drugs as well as Superman and Superwoman. This is from penicillin, and the potency of this non-human actor is vivid as the infection is checked and a little girl will recover. What a story for the media indeed. In conclusion, elaborating a podgerized metaphor of scapes into healthscapes allowed me to focus on all kinds of things medical as forming historical assemblages, infrastructures of assumptions, as well as people, things, places, images, etc. Hellscapes are generated by and through cumulative, especially infrastructural changes, incorporated into each period and available in the next. The three hellscapes vividly demonstrated how, in the US, biomedicine became a public cultural good like public education. Changes across the three hellscapes also underscore how healthcare and things medical are increasingly what Briggs and Hallin called consumer goods in our neoliberal times. U.S. healthscapes also have clear implications for their transnationalization or globalization. These institutionalized legitimacies of biomedicalization flow along digital and other infrastructures of popular cultural discourses, already organizing things medical in faraway places. As an assemblage framework, healthscapes may be useful in conceptualizing empirical studies of healthscapes elsewhere, discussed in an epilogue in our book. In pursuing such work, we need to remember that analytically, co-constitutiveness is not just about medicine and media, but also whatever else is in the situation. The full assemblages per se need to be studied. Moreover, co-constitution is not a terminal analysis, but an invitation to empirical analysis of precisely how it happens in different instantiations. Political economic variations, geopolitics matter, but how? How do co-institutionalization and co-location matter, if and when they do? What we need is what Rosenberg and Starr called ecologies of knowledge, production, demonstration, application, and ultimate displacement, vis-à-vis both biomedicalization and biomediatization, ambitiously pursued. Thank you.
Well, we have a lot to discuss in 30 minutes, so please go at it. Sheldon.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Nick. I found your idea of data. Oh, hi, Nick.
Hi.
Hi. I found your notion of datafication interesting. However, in the literature I've seen, at least sociological literature, there's a lot of use of the notion of big data.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And I was wondering if your concept is similar, overlapping, different, what have you.
Yeah, I've separately written about big data, what in one piece I call the myth of big data, by which I mean, and it's relevant, the apparently natural idea that the aggregation of almost infinite amounts of data, unimaginable until recently, somehow gives us a more direct way into knowing the social. That's, so I think that is a very important area to think about. What I was coming at it from a different angle here, though. So that's important for other reasons, and it is relevant to making it easy for us to make sense that if I do track every aspect of my life, my counting, of course, I allow all that data to be collected by others, to be aggregated, to be computed in ways that I genuinely don't understand. Somehow I will acquire a sort of window into the reality that I live, the reality of my body and its transformations. There's a sort of dataism, I was rushing at that point in the paper, dataism is what Van Dyke calls it, a certain ideology around data, which is certainly seen mainly at the big data level, which is very important to making sense of datafication as something we're doing to ourselves in a non-ideological context on the face of it, something we may very much want to do. We genuinely want to know whether we're running faster, why we're running faster, and so on and so forth. So I think there is that important link, and I didn't have a chance to spell that out. Yeah, I could say more, but I think, yeah, you're right. Thank you.
I'm grateful for all these presentations, and they were wonderful together. So I want to ask a question to all four people, which is, I hear less suspicion, I think, in the book by Charles and Dan about these two terms, biomedicalization and mediatization, but a special focus on datafication. So I don't know if I'm hearing this right, but here's the question. In Nick's case, datafication is a bad development, or that's the question, is it so? And it's datafication, I think, as we see it today, I think we could say that the Protestant ethic in the 17th century was a form of datafication, except that it was urging people to keep track of their own moral data. Biomedicalization for Adele, I think, is also a bad thing. I'm less sure about that, but that's the question. Is it a bad thing? And for Charles and Dan, I think you're more neutral about this. Is that right?
You want to start?
Well, I think what's common between all four, and it's obvious, and so we tend not to emphasize, but it is really worth emphasizing that all of us are firmly moving away from a view of the changes that media make in the social world, which is in any sense media-centric or centric anywhere. We're looking at a multi-dimensional account, absolutely non-linear, in a way underlying all the papers is the sort of move of Latour 20, 30 years ago to deconstruct the notion of power, which as a thing which is there, as that, and rather than seeing power as distributed across an almost infinite number of actors. All of us are involved in the making of media. I've argued that for 15, 20 years. The same is true with biomedicalization and so on. So that's in common. But I think, given the different emphasis of the book, it depends which actor you're looking at. There are many actors that I could choose in relation to datafication. Those, for example, civil society actors who are trying to get information about their cities, maybe levels of pollution, who are using datafication in a sense, in a good way. What I was trying to open up was a way of thinking about the types of social order at the highest level of complexity that might be coming out of this, that might be a lot more concerning than we're allowing for. I'm not saying it's bad, I'm saying we're just not seeing some of the genuinely disturbing implications around liberty, autonomy. That's where I'm going with this. I think there are issues for freedom which are very worrying, even though in the health case, and again, because I was rushing, I didn't have a chance to say this, I quite get it, that we may want to share our data, health data, to cure cancer. Of course. We could agree social compacts to do that. There will be datafication, but under more social and civic control, turning that for the good. I totally allow for that. However, that's not what I see a lot of at the moment. I see the simulation of community, a certain idea of this which is being used for very clearly commercial ends, and that there's a false logic there, a leap, which is very dangerous because we are talking about the construction of social order here, not just about this or that product. This is an extremely deep transformation, and that I think is a matter of common. But medical journalists, on the other hand, may have extremely positive contributions to that. I wouldn't deny that for a moment.
Yeah, you know, Charles used the phrase, he said, we're not here to praise health journalists or to bury them. And I think we were taking that view, not only of journalists, but I mean, the foreground is on health journalism, but similarly with public relations people that we encountered and so on, we think their role is complex. I would say that for me, when I read a lot of the literature about health journalism, it really struck me what a negative tone a lot of it had, and I think I wanted to push back against that. So there's constant use of this term distortion, and this focus on how they supposedly distort the news. And actually, as someone who has studied journalism in a lot of different contexts, it struck me that actually health journalism was rather higher quality than a lot of other journalism I had encountered. Now, there's a whole range of it, right? Actually, just today, there's an article in the Columbia Journalism Review about the way in which economic crisis at local newspapers has pushed it increasingly in the direction of using sponsored content and so on. So it has a lot of problems. But I think that we did want to push back against that very negative image of it. And you find that not only in, like, when public health people write about health news, it's usually to say how it gets the science wrong or something like that. But also, let's say in Joe Dumit's really interesting, important book about pharmaceutical marketing and so on, he kind of treats the journalists as though they're just kind of facilitators, shills in this process by which pharma companies dominate our consciousness. And our research suggested a much more complex view of their role, in which they are, at certain moments, playing this very important role of kind of reasserting the need for boundaries between science and business and so on. So we're trying to point to that complexity more than we are to denounce or to praise.
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for biomedicalization, literally. I walk on a titanium leg, et cetera, held together by a lot of glue. But many people do see it as a critical term, and it can be, as medicalization was taken as often very critical. Our position, and it's one of the things we talked about tons in coming up with and fleshing out the concept, is that the critical issue is the stratification of access to biomedicine, and that could be addressed by a different kind of approach. It's not that science and technology are inherently bad at all. It's which ones get developed, who has access, and what are our future means of distribution going to be that toward greater equity that may involve things like redistribution, ration distribution, allocations, caps on individual expenditures, but access for all up to a certain level would, I think we would be much more interested in the use, but then also what science is undone. David Hess at Vanderbilt has a concept called undone science, and it captures a lot, some of the historical stuff that I went into earlier, where the kind of sciences and technologies that have gotten developed since 1900 basically are those that are going to make money. And there are many kinds of things that don't make much money. And why do we have so few contraceptives? Because they don't make much money. Why? There are all those kinds of things. So there's undone science that is more science for what people who can't afford lots of things need. So I would be more interested in a more democratically set agenda for the doing of different kinds of sciences, and et cetera. So it's complicated, but it is not intended as solely critical. It can be very critical in certain circumstances of distribution. So yeah.
That's a great question, partly
It
because
is.
it brings together these different areas, and I thank you. So I want you to know that I'm speaking on the 9th of February, 2017. So to speak against the sort of humanistic mission of medicine, or to speak about, in some sense, the role that journalists see themselves as being able to think about publics and truth and information, it's probably not the moment at which I want to say, oh, what a bad set of things to do. The second point is, we actually came into this with a whole set of blame game things going on, so that by and large, public health officials blamed reporters blamed actually, of course, newspaper reporters blamed television reporters, and exchanged stereotypes in such a way that, frankly, people really seemed to have little idea what was going on, or why this was so important, what very, very important sorts of narratives were going on and how they involved all of us, both as producers of this kind of knowledge as well as receivers. I had an experience when I was doing a book on cholera epidemic that was in Venezuela, when I gave a presentation at the Rollins School of Public Health at Emory University, which happens to be next to the CDC. And there were a number of leading public health officials there in the audience, and they said, how do you think this way that you're looking at these epidemiological decisions, some of these policy decisions weren't very good, but if you turn that into a caricature of public policy professionals, what is your audience going to be? And I really thought about that. So one thing I think we wanted to do was to engage journalists, to be able to engage clinicians, to be able to engage a whole range of public health officials, to be able to think about these. So how is it that we could grasp the logics and the constraints under which they operated? And some sort of easy dismissal. First of all, what does that make us? God? Frankly, the more I did the research, the less I felt like God, right? Because we were actually dealing with so many different domains, with so many different sorts of logics. Insofar as we could grasp some of those, that was quite remarkable. But clearly a great deal of it escaped us, right? We weren't practicing journalism without, or medicine, or public health, or other fields without licenses. So, there has to be, I think, a moment, there's criticism, but there's also modesty at some point of being able to say, who are we to sit in judgment? A third point here is we really, in some sense, try to get to blow up the terms media and medicine. It's not saying we need to combine them. We need to see, and those categories prevent us from understanding this important reality, which is not just about health news, but exists all the way through these different sorts of spaces and how it travels. And I would say in there, frankly, some things we find, coverage of pharmaceuticals and biotechs is very different than coverage of epidemics, is very different than coverage of new medical discoveries. If we use the term biomedicalization to make everything look the same and seem if it all operates in the same way, we have failed miserably, because part of the point of the book is to say, that when all of a sudden you're facing the possibility of a newly emerging virus, that's a really different moment than, for example, dealing with diabetes. So thinking about some of the specificities. And finally, so one thing we're really concerned with is that every health news story creates a new assemblage. Mm-hmm. It creates a new assemblage, partly because a whole new range of actors are involved in producing that story. And the story also projects a whole range of different sorts of people, between patients and clinicians, researchers, public health officials, etc. Each story. But every story also maps knowledge production circulation. Where did the information come from? New England Journal of Medicine. Right? Or maybe there's a whole epidemiological study that was done. So there's the projection of who makes knowledge about health. How does it travel? Well, it travels through your clinician. It's traveling through health communication, through these various sorts of mechanisms. And where is it going? It's being received by the public, or potentially that's no longer a model anymore. So that's the old sort of top-down linear model. And frankly, the idea that we place patients in the position of not being able to produce any significant information about their own bodies is probably not good for health or for journalism. Or we have what we call the neoliberal model, where, hey folks, it's all up to you, make your own decisions, find all your own information from all these different sources, sort it all out, understand how yoga and all these different medical specialties and perhaps Wudin all work, and put it together. Kind of a hard task, and then what happens is you become a consumer. right? You're the perfect consumer responsible for, if you get it wrong, you go to the wrong place, you use the wrong information, and you're sick, then tough luck, it's your fault. And frankly, that's one place where at least I think we said, that's not good, right? That's not good. First of all, because none of us, with a very few exceptions here, I know at least there are a couple of medical practitioners here, are not necessarily seen as being producers of knowledge here. Most of our efforts to circulate knowledge, which are now proliferating through social media and other significant areas, we're actually potentially obstructing these legitimate forms of circulation. And frankly, that is one place where we felt critical, at least for myself, and thinking, what might those alternatives be? So you mentioned a sort of radical democratization of medicine. We looked at this as a project of thinking about the possibility of a radical democratization of biomediatization, of ideas about who produces knowledge about health and disease, how they circulate, and how that links all of us in these new forms of sociology. So that would be my sense. Great question.
Nick, you want to add one more thing?
Well, just on the critique, I think that's a very important point, because I might have sounded as offering a polemic against the conspiracy of datafication, but actually, if I have more time to, and in our book, it's quite the opposite. It's not that there's any conspiracy. It's just that the set of new interdependencies are having certain consequences which may be very damaging. They're externalities that no one is planning. And they're driven by things such as how to create economic value. The advertising industry, and we were talking about that earlier, the advertising industry has to reach its audiences, is doing so through continuous data tracking. Not because it wants some sort of quasi-political power, of course not. They're trying to solve the problems of capital, in that case, or advertising within capital. So I think one has to get away from any notion of a simple critique and operate within a plural universe where there's no value center and so on and so forth. And that's why Latour and also Boltanski and Taverneau and all these other critics are moving to a different notion of how critique works. But it can still be critical in the end, because the externalities of all these changes may be profoundly disturbing and intended by no one. And again, that's why Elias for us is a helpful theorist, because he was interested in externalities rather than conspiracies.
I wanted to respond to the point about big data, and I actually think that what you're saying adds something to the conversation about big data, because you mentioned that you are interested in the nature of social reality. You're interested in the social spaces in which these exchanges take place, and that's a problem for data. And I think you're getting at that in terms of algorithms and other functional models of social behavior have a difficult time understanding and modeling continuous processes. They're very good at modeling different states, encapsulating different states, so like connections between people and particular messages sent and received. So it's an issue for data and quantification to talk about a processual kind of unfolding of data and relationships. And you even said data is about the process of establishing relations between us, and data emerges from those continuous, like a continuous activity. And so you're actually, I don't know if you meant to do this, but you're really saying, well, in all this data that we have, what is the unit? Like, you're talking about a processual ongoing process, I think. And data is actually not well equipped to manage those processes. So I'm wondering if you could say more about your understanding of data in the context of an event that is unfolding and not a single received or sent occasion.
Well, you raised a deep point, which we probably need a data scientist in the room rather than me to answer, but you hit on a very important point, which is that to create things which can enter databases, which can be aggregated, calculated on, a transformation has to take place, which is a selection has to be made from the stream of reality. Now, it's possible that we're living the dream at the moment of, if we track everything we know that there is to be tracked, and we do so continuously, and we put it together in a pile which can in some sense be computed credibly, then we see a reality. But that is not the same as tracking the processes you're talking about. So this is the dream of dataism, which is dangerous because it can never get close to what it offers. But there's tremendous economic forces behind that offer. Tremendous economic forces, colossal investments. And this, I think, is affecting, or I would say, social knowledge generally. But that's something for a book that I'm about to write, is how is the nature of social knowledge changing? And I think this will have impacts on self-knowledge, medical knowledge, and so on, because our sense of where expertise can lie is being reshaped. By stitching together the spaces where knowledge can go, new spaces, other spaces fall out of the mix.
And what also falls out is what can't be counted.
Yes.
Right? I mean, in an article that Nick has coming out and something I wrote recently, we both quote the title of the same book, which is There's No Such Thing as Raw Data. And you probably know that book. I can't remember the name of the author. Gittleman.
Oh,
yeah. So I mean, so much is lost by the time you reduce something to something that can be input.
Yeah.
And some of the things that sociologists and others are interested in are the kinds of things that can't squeeze through those.
Totally, and it also becomes a commentary on time in general. If you think you can map every state for the perfect input into a database, it means that perhaps you profess some control, not control over, but time becomes an interesting question. If we understand time as every moment that encapsulates a system in a quantified manner to be put into a database, time becomes kind of an interesting problem.
We have time for more questions. Please, Laura.
I think that was a really interesting point, and it's true that it's a continuous stream and you can't capture what you can't measure and all that kind of stuff. But if you take seriously the commercial underpinnings of what's going on right now and the speed with which companies now process in real time 5,000 and 6,000 data points on millions of people at once, bargaining for their eyeballs on websites that have profound effects on what people purchase, what's available to them, what's offered to them, and now our politics. I'm curious about what the panel thinks of, despite the fact that the algorithms can't get there, and I am on the edge of my knowledge here, so I can't go any further than that, but it seems like we have what appears to be real-time processing of data, as impossible as that sounds, and based on commercial actors. So we have the consequence of it, even though we might not have the perfection of it, if you know what I mean. So I wonder if you could say more about that.
I have one thought about that. I was struck by one of the slides in Adele's presentation about, putting the same image in front of all the, all the eyes. And of course, that's not our current media reality. And I think that that's one of the things that we're still, in my other field of political communication, obviously everybody's really focused on that right now. But as far as health communication is concerned too, and health, mediatization of health and medicine, I think that there's still a lot more that we need to think through about the current situation of targeted media, right? What popped into my head as I started thinking about this was the difference between the H1N1 and Ebola epidemics. The Ebola epidemic started unfolding just as we were trying to finish our book, and it was really frustrating to us because we could have written a whole book about that, but we had to wrap this thing up. So we discussed it a little, but they were very different in the sense that during the H1N1 epidemic, the CDC and the mainstream media, they basically dominated the framing of the issue. There was a lot of research we were looking at that we thought was really interesting, that was looking at what was circulating on social media and showed that for the most part it was the mainstream media stories. I think that Ebola was very different. Ebola took place in a context of, it was an election year, And there was a lot of intervention by politicians, and there were various ways in which the public health authorities didn't really keep control of the conversation. I don't know, they could have given the context. And I suspect that if you did research on the circulation of information in social media, you would find that not everybody was getting the same message in that case. And that's something, this is a dimension of biomediatization that I think we still need to know a whole lot more about.
Maybe I could recognize myself to ask a question of our two presenters. One of the ways in which these, particularly we might think about the datafication of epidemiology or the epidemiology of datafication, was in the projection that now we could more accurately predict the emergence of new epidemics by actually monitoring people's searches for words like flu or for looking for flu remedies. So here you have the idea that actually epidemiology itself could be automated. Now, it seems in the end this was tremendous promise, right? You can put all the epidemiologists practically out of business here. Turns out it didn't work out to be quite that simple in the end. That, the big data actually told you, a week before people were showing up at the ER with a newly emerging disease. So what do you think? Here's one specific point where imaginations, where you're thinking about numbers and populations in macro and very complicated sorts of ways, we're coming together precisely with datafication. Here's a place where, biomedicalization and mediatization, and specifically datafication, really were probably at their closest point.
Well, I think that is an interesting case. If we just step back a moment, I think what both the last two questions were about, I would translate as saying, how do we think about the consequences of sociality being computed? I've got a colleague at LSE who's a data scientist who's developing this notion of computed sociality. A social life that we're only able to access in discourse if it's passed through all the transformations that counting by vast systems of computers requires. And so that cuts a lot out, but in a way we can't access anymore because it's not even accessible within the discourse about the social. It's just out of the picture. That has two consequences. We haven't yet fully theorized this in the way it's been done in the medical field. That's why I say datafication is a primitive concept at this point, and I acknowledge that. But there is a gradual authorizing of data institutions and those who produce, who collect data, with a sort of authority to access the social, in a sense, more directly than others can. And that takes two forms, to put it crudely. One is proxies. Of course, the Google flu, that case was obviously a case of a failed proxy. It was a silly one. But there are many more other more complex proxies which are often for social knowledge, which have not yet been found to not work, which are always proxies. They operate indirectly on the basis of certain assumptions that this set of data will allow you to guess reliably about the totality. And also experimentation, going back to the flow point. The famous Facebook case of the illegitimate experiment of using the platform to put certain messages out there and see what people do, of course, was illegitimate and rejected. But this notion that those who own platforms and those who generate data or deal with data in some sense are somehow licensed to experiment on the world by playing with data and therefore see into it better is a very common one now, and it is changing our sense of where social knowledge comes from, and I think it's going to have very long consequences. So you're right. We've seen early versions of the sort of absurdities that came out from that. It's the non-absurdities that worry me. It's the biggest shifts in the definitions of knowledge that we have to be more worried about than the Google flu case, which was relatively quickly exposed within a year or two or a few months.
Other questions?
So we talked about, or you talked about neoliberalism turning into patient consumerism. So with that said, you had said something about if you get sick, it's your fault. So how does the medical community regulate information that's going through social media that's pretty dangerous, and it's a lot of pseudoscience that's getting into the narrative of medical lingo? So how do you propose that we stop that?
Good question. I should say my point was specifically not about the information that's made available, but the model of information of knowledge production, circulation, and reception, right? So actually this could exist with a lot of different forms of content. I mean, we're taught when we see a news story to focus on the biomedical content. Oh my God, you know, today in the New York Times, there's an article on a particular type of device used often for removing fibroid tumors, which can actually have very serious effects. And thinking about, well, here was knowledge that was not shared with the FDA, and therefore patients are dying from the use of this particular medical technology. So think about what's going on in this one article. First of all, right, there's a projection of they're conveying to you knowledge that might lead to your own demise if you actually had a fibroid tumor which turned out to be malignant. So there's that communication to patients. On the same hand, there's a model of what should have happened, the normal flow of knowledge, production and circulation, and how that did not occur around this particular technology. So we're learning about that technology, but we get two different cycles of ways of thinking about how it is the medical profession should communicate with the FDA and how it is that people within that area are communicating with us as readers. So that's really what we're focusing on. Not in terms of the content is a whole different sort of area. And now people have, again, people access medical journals, a whole range of different sort of websites. That's one thing we found, that the people who responded, we talked to just ordinary folks, we're accessing an amazing array of different sorts of sites of knowledge production. It increases all the time. So that actually is a different question. We're talking about you are responsible for being able to find all of this information out and use it. It's a model of knowledge. Then there's the question of what forms of knowledge are out there, and that's very different. So I don't know if other people want to think about that. At this point, sort of policing the flow of biomedical knowledge. Of course, this is part of really the historical picture that you suggested.
Yeah. My curiosity, and I don't know if it's a direct answer to your question at all, but as your book demonstrates, suddenly the AMA disappears. Where are they and what are they doing about the increased flows of medical knowledge that may or may not be reasonably accurate? Where are the sites of medical authorities taking some kind of positions or responsibility, or jumping up and down and shouting that of their shared concerns with consumers about being able to assess the quality of the information that's available to so many of us on the internet with a few clicks? So I'm very curious about if anybody is stepping forward. I haven't noticed it.
Well, I would say that was certainly one of the things we found. That's one of the roles that health journalists play, is to warn people and to advise people about how to consume information on the internet.
Interesting.
Right? So
and medicine has abdicated its role in this, in terms of what you saw.
No, here the journalists are mediators, right? Here the journalists make use of experts within biomedicine, and they tend very strongly to be defenders of evidence-based medicine. Right? Now, as we know from the realm of politics, the influence of mainstream journalists is not universal, right? And maybe becoming undermined in some ways. But certainly they try to take on that role, right? Of policing that flow of information and also advising people about how to negotiate.
So I think this is something that occurs to me. He says the health journalists that we spoke with spoke about getting hundreds of press releases a day. Lots of different requests. Look, this is something we want you to put out there within the mainstream media. And one of their major functions they said was to say what's a story and what really deserves treatment. So that was actually in a major sort of, but it's fascinating in terms of medical communities. Two of my greatest interviews I really enjoyed. One was with my general practitioner. So I went in for my annual, I reported in the book, general checkup, and he said, well, there's a PSA, what do you think? And I said, well, I actually know the literature pretty well. If it were your body, what would you do? And he said, oh no, I never give my patients advice. I just help them sort through all the information that goes their way. So I said, oh, this is great. Listen, can I come back next week and interview you? And it was fantastic. So he said, I really like all this bombarding of information my patients get. And, I just want to sit there with them and help them think about that. So he was not a police person. Now, my dentist said, my patients come in and they gut stuff in the media and it's all wrong, and half of my work is educating them to get rid of all that false information. Those are two practitioners in Berkeley, right? In very, very different positions with respect to this. So I think that what you'd find is everything at this point, even among the class of medical practitioners. Among many of the people we interviewed at the consumers of medical information, some people are avid consumers and they're just worried about everything. We know it's all wrong, it's all terrible, but I just look and look and look, right? And some other people just say, oh, well, it's all lies. So I think it's amazing now the heterogeneity of how these processes work, and that's shifting all the time. So I think we're, now if we take any more time to talk, we will be taking time away from your ability to go back into the other room and get something to eat and drink, and also engage in more formal and particularly possibly more fruitful conversations with one another. But I would appreciate if you could come back and join us again at 4 o'clock. And maybe another round of applause for our two presenters.